Much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very happy to take this, the final Labour Party call on this year's budget debate, a budget that demonstrates very clearly that this government have their priorities all wrong. This budget, like so much of what the National Party do, is about John Key's mates, not Kiwis' mates. That's what this budget is all about, because this is a government that have totally and utterly failed to adapt to the changing global economic environment. The merchant banking outlook has failed the world economy, and clinging to it harms, not helps us here in New Zealand, and yet this government refuses to confront that reality and deal with that reality. The Labour Party accepts and acknowledges that things have changed. Economic growth has to be based on the real economy, on businesses that create products and services that bring real growth and real jobs to New Zealand, not speculation. The National Party is all about speculation and divvying up and selling off what previous generations have built up for New Zealanders. They are not growing anything for the future. They are divvying up and hocking off what we have been left by those who came before us. They are not creating the brighter future that John Key promised to New Zealanders. They are not leaving a brighter future legacy for future generations of New Zealanders. They are content simply to divvy up and hock off what we have left. That is not going to lead to a better New Zealand for future generations of New Zealanders. The national government, this is the same national government that is doing backroom deals to trade the misery of pokie machines for a convention centre. This is not a government that is focused on looking after those at the bottom of the economic pile. They are only interested in those at the top. Their mates, the people who benefited from the tax cuts, the people who give money to the National Party, not the people at the bottom of the economic heap who are facing ever-rising costs of living. They are losing their jobs, and yet the National Party does nothing. They are suffering from increases in GST, and yet Bill English rubs his hands together and happily takes that money so that he can continue to dish out tax cuts to those at the top of the heap. But the single biggest thing that this government have failed to deal with in this year's budget, as in all of Bill English's budget, his fifth budget, he has failed to deal with this, and that is the fact that New Zealand has the largest deficit in the world. New Zealand has the largest deficit in the world, even bigger than Greece. So when Bill English talks about Greece and how New Zealand shouldn't follow the road that the government in Greece are following, what he fails to acknowledge is that in fact we are in worse shape than Greece. We have a bigger deficit than Greece, and Bill English is not doing anything about that. He is leaving for future generations of New Zealand masses and masses of debt. Masses and masses of debt, because rather than growing the real economy, the productive economy that will lead to more jobs for New Zealand and more income for New Zealand in the future, Bill English is only interested in hocking off what little we've got left. That is totally wrong. This is a government that's got its priorities all wrong, and I guess the reason for that is this is a government beset by scandals and by distractions. From John Key's cup of tea deal that's now landed up in him being in the dock in court, through to Peter Dunn rorting the parliamentary system so that he can pretend to be a party leader, claiming over $120,000 in extra funding every year by pretending to lead a party that doesn't even exist. Then we've got the Aaron Gilmore saga. He lifted the veil on the arrogance that pervades the National Party because they think they are better than the rest of New Zealand. They genuinely believe that they are better than the rest of New Zealand, and the reason they got rid of Aaron Gilmore was not necessarily because of what he did, but because of what it betrayed about the true state and the true attitudes of those who are in the National Party. But actually give Aaron Gilmore credit. At least he paid for the drinks that he was shouting at a National Party conference, unlike Phil Wheatley, who was quite happy to clock it up on his ministerial credit card. At least Aaron Gilmore put it on his own credit card and paid for it himself, unlike Phil Wheatley, unlike that member Bill English, the Minister of Finance, whose first decisions as Minister of Finance was to work out how much more he could rort out of the housing allowances available to ministers of the Crown. His biggest priority was working out how much more he could pay his cleaner. Wasn't interested in the cleaners on the minimum wage, wasn't interested in them at all, interested in getting more cleaning for his house. Didn't matter about all the minimum wage cleaners who are out there who have been completely ignored by this government. Then, of course, we've got the Pansy Wong scandal. Pansy Wong resigned from Parliament in a corruption scandal. Richard Worth resigned from Parliament in a scandal, but we're not allowed to know what that was because John Key lost confidence in Richard Worth but won't tell anybody why. This is a government that has accumulated scandals. Over 5 years, they have accumulated more scandals than any other government in that period of time. Than any other government in 5 years. Bill English, John Key and their colleagues have been accumulating baggage, accumulating scandals, and it has distracted them from the real job of governing in the best interests of all New Zealanders. This is a government that is stuck in the past, that are stuck in a rort. That's what I was going to say, a rut, but a rort's just as good because that's what they're doing. They're in a rut, rorting the system, and they are not interested in what's happening to ordinary, everyday New Zealanders. Let's look at their education budget. What did they do in education? They cut funding to kotahitanga. One of those programs that has got a proven track record of delivering for people who haven't been succeeding in the education system. Te kotahitanga, they cut that and they gave $19 million to charter schools. They increased the funding for private schools and cut funding for teacher professional development. That says a lot about their priorities. Here's another one that's a cracker. Not many people have picked this up yet. They cut $4 million out of special needs transport. This is the money that transports kids with special needs from their homes to the schools. And the government cut $4 million out of that budget. $4 million came out of that budget. $5 million came out of the budget for teacher training scholarships. This is a government that really don't care about a quality teaching workforce. They're deregulating, don't have to have qualified teachers in charter schools, cut the funding for professional development for teachers, cut the funding for teacher training scholarships. This government aren't interested in a qualified, registered teaching profession. Oh no, not at all. They ignore the fact that quality teaching is the biggest in-school influencing factor on student achievement. But then, of course, they ignore all of the out-of-school influences on student achievement. So why should they be focused on the in-school ones, given that they won't do anything about the out-of-school ones either? This year's budget, of course, they found more money for NovaPay, that absolute shambles that Bill English and Hekia Parata and Craig Foss signed off on, despite the fact that it had 147 known defects that none of those 3 rocket scientists that signed it off thought to ask, oh, there are 147 known defects, what are they? No one actually thought to ask what they were. And had they done that, had those ministers on their $250,000 a year salaries bothered to actually read the briefing papers they got given, Bill English's signature scrawled on it, didn't date it surprisingly, I suspect that's because he didn't really read it, they signed off on it without even reading it and without asking the basic questions, and New Zealanders continue to pay for their mistakes. Millions and millions of dollars going into NovaPay to clean up the mess made by the incompetence of the three ministers who signed off on NovaPay without checking out the details first. And the money, the new money that they had promised in this year's budget, when we read through that carefully, actually a whole lot of that money comes from lower than expected roles in primary and secondary schools. So it's not new money at all. It's money that they're just taking from one part of the education budget and moving to another. It is smoke and mirrors stuff. But what is clear overall is that this is not a budget that demonstrates a government that is committed to education, committed to the things that work. It is not a budget that is focused on the needs of ordinary, everyday New Zealanders. It is a budget that's focused on John Key helping out his mates, not helping out Kiwis' mates. It's about Key's mates not Kiwis, mates. New Zealanders deserve so much better from their government. That's why after the next election, when they have a Labour government, they will have a government that's focused on the future, that is focused on positive policies that will make a real difference for New Zealanders.
Members' time has expired. Tim McIndoe.
And since 2000...